All right, praising God this time for mercy, but maybe just as much the wisdom to understand it. Let's just call Amos chapter 4 mercy, in a chapter that begins with a relatively harsh rebuke once again against the privileged in Israel, this time the privileged women, or a class of privileged women in Israel, and the way that in comparison to the Proverbs 31 woman, the way in which instead of providing balance in a home that may be out of balance, they seem to be aiding their husbands in some of the wrongs that are going on in Israel at this time. As in verse 4 or verses 4 and 5, instead of calling them to repentance, this time he seems to be just telling them to carry on in a chapter that, if you remember what it's like to fly, if you had a chance to fly and you get that roughly 30-minute ding before the flight attendant comes on and says, we are now about to begin our descent into whatever city you're descending into. It's almost like Amos 4 is a call that they are now beginning their descent into destruction. As the rest of the chapter is going to go on to talk about the history of God's attempts to get their attention coming up to this point. Verse 6 talking about or beginning a series of roughly, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe 6 things that God has done trying to get their attention, following each of the things that he has done with yet you did not return to me, declares the Lord. Verse 6 beginning to talk about the way that he gave them what they'll call cleanness of teeth, or prophet will call cleanness of teeth, representing what seems to be a lack of bread or food. Even though they had that period of difficulty, it's going to seem that at each of these periods of difficulty, he showed them some mercy. That's our title. But going on, verses 7 and 8, we'll talk about how he withheld the rain. Verse 9, going on to talk about the way that he struck them with blight and mildew. And like we saw in the book of Joel, locust. Going on to verse 10 to say that he sent pestilence and killed and carried away, yet once again it did not strike them to return to God. Verse 11 saying how he overthrew them, similar to the way that he overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah, saying that he only overthrew a portion of them, not necessarily bringing total destruction, which is what he seems to be introducing in verse 12 and 13, the end of the chapter, saying, therefore, in a relatively famous statement, thus I will do to you, O Israel, because I will do this to you. Prepare to meet your God, O Israel. As he goes on in verse 13 to conclude the chapter, and something that reminded me of what it's so easy to do in those times when God shows us mercy. See, the thing that caught me, at least caught my attention in this chapter, is the way in which each of these stages, as we mentioned in the last chapter, they're just temporary. They're things that God did that seem to end in a period of mercy, only to introduce the next thing designed to get their attention, followed by a period of mercy. And over time, what seems to be happening at each stage is something that we've seen previous authors lament, and that is our tendency to confuse mercy with permission. Quite possibly similar to the way that we might look at one of those stock graphs that have a whole lot of small term bumps, but they trend in a certain direction. We've used that trend model before to describe the way in which it is so dangerous to make too much of a short-term movement in one of those graphs. Why? Because ultimately those movements are trending in a larger direction. And likewise in our lives, if we make too much of the relief that God gives us in an individual moment, we can lose track of the way that his messages to us are trending. And that seems to be exactly what has gotten Israel into a point where God is no longer cautioning them to turn, as much as he seems to simply be saying, carry on, as they begin their descent into destruction. A point we will see him pick up in chapter 5.